Hello and welcome. I'm delighted that we're able to bring you this session on Ariana Neumann's remarkable book. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome back to the Chiswick Book Festival Anne Sebba, who's going to interview her. Anne has spoken at our festival about her previous books, That Woman and Les Parisiennes, and she's now working on a biography of the spy Ethel Rosenberg. We look forward to hearing about that at a future festival. For now, I'll ask her to introduce and to interview Ariana Neumann.
Thank you very much, Torrin. It's wonderful to be here, virtually to be here. I'm very fond of the Chiswick Book Festival. So to be able to interview someone who I think has written a really spectacular book at Chiswick is a great honor for me. I really couldn't be more delighted to share Ariana Neumann with you all today. I first heard about this book 2 years ago, and I remember when I read it, time really stopped for me, and that is the title of the book, When Time Stopped, and you'll realize why when you read it. It has so many different meanings and so many different layers. Ariana is a natural storyteller. What a story she has to tell. But the reason her book is so special is because it is precisely about layers of uncovering. So let nobody think this is, quote, just another Holocaust book. The Holocaust is a background, but far from it. Nor is it just another book about a father and daughter, nor is it just a thriller, nor is it merely about the psychological damage that the last war, the last century did to so many people. You learn about Ariana's grandparents, you learn about growing up in Venezuela, you learn about what it is to discover something about yourself that you never knew. So the way that she tells this story and the way it unfolds is truly thrilling. Of course, you learn also about fear and being brave, and you question all the time, at least I did, would I have had that courage? So it is an extraordinary book, but I'm now going to let Ariana tell you all about it. Amazingly, it's her first book, although she has worked as a journalist, she's married, has 3 children, and now lives in London. You'll discover a lot about her, I'm sure, as she tells you about her book. How did it all start? Because obviously this is something that is seared so deep into you. What was it about this moment that you thought, I can't talk about this anymore, I can't live with this story, I actually have to write it? And I realized that it's not just a question of writing it, as a fellow author, years and years of research went into it. So what prompted you to say, enough is enough, this has to be what I do?
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for being here with me and for interviewing me. And I love the Chiswick Literary Festival as well. My children go to school in Hammersmith. I'm constantly in Chiswick, and it's a great honor to be here. So thank you. It all started, it all started very slowly, and it didn't start off as a book. So I didn't start thinking, okay, I have to write the story down and then do the research. It happened the other way around, really. So I grew up in Venezuela in a vibrant, colorful, happy country filled with potential. The daughter of a very successful industrialist in a beautiful house in the middle of the city. And I had absolutely every joy you could have as a little child. I have a father who doted on me, a very interesting mother who did as well. And all I knew about my father, who was much older when I came along, he was 50, was that he had escaped a broken Europe, is what I had been told, in 1949, and moved to Venezuela from Prague. So that's all I knew. There was never any conversation at all about the past, about what he had left behind. It was all about the present and the future. And yet I knew, I think I always knew, that there was something very mysterious. There was something that wasn't quite right, something that jarred with our life. And there were little clues as to why that was so. So there was no talk at all about family in Prague or grandparents or life before. There were horrendous nightmares. So my father would wake up screaming in a language I didn't understand, which I now know to be Czech or German, and he would wake the whole household up as he screamed with these terrible nightmares. There was a little bit of shaking, so I knew there was a no-go area. There were questions if I asked, were simply met with a wall of silence and often shaking. So I knew always that there was a mystery to solve, I suppose. And then I started a detective club, as little kids do, with my good friends, and we would meet on Saturday and we would spy on people. And we would then report to each other in sort of very serious tones what activities the gardener undertook or my father was doing. And it was one of those afternoons that I found an ID card. I found a mysterious box, actually. I was told it was a mysterious box by my fellow cousin. And I was my fellow detective and spy, and he had produced a very detailed report about how my father had moved this box very carefully as if it contained some treasure. And I waited for everybody to go, and I found this box, and I have this box still here with me. So, and I found the most remarkable thing. So my father was called Hans Neumann. He was born in Prague. His date of birth was February 9th, 1921. And as I opened the box, I found this ID card, and I don't know if you can see it, but it was quite astonishing for a child to find, because of course that stamp, immediately I knew what it was about. I recognized my father's face because he had these very distinct eyes. He looked much more wrinkled by the time I came along. And of course the name.
Very handsome young man.
Well, don't know about that, but the name, I don't know if you can see it, is Anne Sebba. And the date of birth, which is actually on the back, is the 11th of March, 1921. So that was a little wrong, and his name was completely wrong. And then, of course, it was dated Berlin, 1943. So that terrified me. And I ran to my mother and said, there's something there. There's something. He's an imposter. This man that we're living with is not who he says he is. And I was told to calm down. I was told he had a difficult war. Don't ask him any questions because he cannot speak.
So that was never explained to you at the time, how he could have two names?
No, it wasn't. I mean, it was at some stage I was told he had to pretend to be someone else. And I'm not sure whether it was that day or if it was later on. But that was really all I knew. And then my father died in 2001. And you know, I had throughout my life, I was 30 then, I had throughout my life asked questions, and there had been very few answers. I had even traveled with him to Prague. And there had been moments where you could tell there was so much hidden inside him, so much that he had to just, that he couldn't speak about. But it wasn't until he died, where he had cleared all his papers, the entire house had been emptied, and he had left me this box. So it was at that moment that I realized, not that I needed to write a book, but that I had the permission to solve this mystery that I had always lived with.
Because actually when he died, the box was strangely refilled with additional papers and documents.
There was a lot more, so it wasn't just my ID card.
Yes.
There were all sorts of documents of what I now know was his undercover, was his life as someone else in Berlin between 1943 and 1945. So it was crammed with documents. And that's when I knew that I finally had that permission to delve into the past, to solve the mystery. And I did it for myself, so I didn't do it because I wanted to write a book. But as I uncovered the mystery, a few things happened. So I didn't have a eureka moment where I said, okay, this has to be a book, really. It was very, very slow, in the sense that as I uncovered these stories and I traced people all over the world, so I went to the Czech Republic, I traced people in Indonesia, in Paris, in California, in Leeds.
Where did you start? Do you remember how you began to trace people? I mean, your mother obviously knew about his past, but she wasn't a part of his past. So how do you start on that search?
So, but my mother knew very little. So she knew this, you know, the broad sketch, I would say. She didn't know any of the details. at all. So she, for example, she knew he had been hidden in Berlin, or he had lived in Berlin, didn't know for how long, knew that there was a fake identity, didn't, I think the name, when I said his best friend Stenik Tuma helped him, rang a bell, but she wasn't aware of the name. She wasn't aware of the details. She didn't know, for example, that he had been volunteered to be part of the fire brigade, so that when the bombs rained on Berlin, instead of going to the shelter with everyone else, my father had to go up just to rescue people and to put out fires. So it was
one thing leads to another.
One thing leads to another, and I started uncovering. Well, I mean, the way you sort of do it is I would come in and I started reading the documents. I don't speak German. Every time someone who spoke German came in and I felt comfortable enough, I'd say, listen, do you know, I have this old document, do you know what it says? And then I started asking questions. I have some slightly older cousins who were, my father had a brother called Lothar, who also survived the war. And Lothar spoke a little more to his children than my father did to mine. And luckily one of them lives in London. And I asked her questions. And eventually, as I was asking questions, Lothar's widow, who was an elderly lady living in Switzerland, when she was downsizing from her house to a smaller flat, as one does, she found this box and she sent it to me. And it was a box filled with letters. So there were about 50 letters from my grandparents, who of course I've never met, and who were interned in the concentration camp of Terezin, just outside of Prague, from 1942 to 1944. So I started with those. I had those translated. That's very difficult because you can't just find a Czech translator from the Czech embassy to
and it's reading the handwriting. And I would say there are two aspects that are really at the heart of the book. And one of them is your grandparents' story, and I'd love to talk a bit more in detail about that. And a parallel story is your father at the time and him going into hiding, because, I mean, there are so many aspects, as I say, of this story, but perhaps we can talk a little bit about your grandparents, who, of course, you never met, your father's parents. What did you discover about them? Tell us their story.
Well, I feel, it's true that I never met them, but I feel incredibly close to them now because I've had this marvelous window, which are their personal letters to their boys who were outside. So what I've discovered is that my father had a normal Czech family. They lived in Prague. There were 4 of them. There was my grandmother Ella, who was filled with joy and light and loved music, and there was my grandfather Otto, who was the opposite. I'm not sure, but he was very disciplined and stern and very serious. They were assimilated. They weren't. They celebrated a little bit of everything. My grandfather wasn't particularly religious. He liked Gandhi and was very taken with Asian religions. And he owned a paint factory called Montana, which is remarkable to me because I grew up in Venezuela with a paint factory called Montana as well, and had no idea that was the original Montana had been in Prague in the 30s. And they had 2 boys, Lothar, who was born in 1918 and who was very serious and very studious, and Hans, who is my father, who was born in 1921, who wasn't at all studious, who was a prankster. He was quite bright and was very good at chemistry, but used his knowledge more to build stink bombs, I've now discovered, than for anything more useful. And they lived a relatively normal life, if you can call life in Central Europe when you're Jewish with the rising anti-Semitism normal. But I think they felt somehow it wasn't going to happen to them. So it wasn't until 1939, as the net tightened, that they actually applied for visas to leave, and they applied for visas to the US. But of course, as you know, the US had quotas for not specifically against Jews, but against people from Central Europe, which at that time were all Jews. So they couldn't get out. So the Nazis marched into Prague on March 1939. My uncle Lothar had a marvelous girlfriend called Stenka. Stenka wasn't Jewish. She was financially independent. She was beautiful and brave. She was studying law and drove her own car. And she's really this absolutely marvelous character.
Yes, she is an extraordinary character in your book. I think what many people will find surprising who aren't familiar with this literature is first of all how long they survived in Theresienstadt, how difficult it was to survive, how Zdenka was incredibly brave to pretend to be Jewish to go in, but how you've uncovered the detail of the camps. I mean, I think that's an extraordinary aspect of your book that really will bring it home to any Holocaust deniers, should they be there, or historians, to understand life in the camp, because these letters are deeply emotional and tell you about how really tough it was to survive, but your grandparents were absolutely determined. I wonder if you can just give us a flavor of these letters and what you discovered.
Of course, so, I mean, basically what happened to my grandparents, my grandparents specifically, was that my grandmother was deported first. She was deported in May 1942. The deportation notice arrived. It had my grandmother's name, my grandfather's name, and my father's name. Lothar's name wasn't included because he was protected by being married to a non-Jew. So my family tried to fight the system however they could. So they managed, after huge efforts, to get my father and my grandfather out of the transport list, but not my grandmother. So she is deported alone, much to everyone's horror. She arrives in Terezin. She survives by act of sheer, by complete luck, as these things happen most of the times. She was meant to go to Sobibor in a transport that was shot on arrival. And luckily for me, because I had 2 lovely years of her letters, that wasn't the case. So she, and luckily, of course, for everyone else. So she is interned in Terezin. The family don't know where she is until August. In August, news trickle down that she is actually in Terezin, and Stenka decides that she's going to sneak into Theresienstadt, which is a camp. I mean, it's not a camp like Auschwitz is a camp, but it's still a camp. It's a ghetto. It's guarded. She sneaks in and she takes a couple of little things that my grandmother loved, a shawl and some biscuits and some little goodies and some currency, and goes to see her. And I have my grandmother's letter from that day. So it's the first letter that she then, they set up a system of contraband into the camp, and out come these wonderful letters, which is why I'm lucky to have these letters at all. But my grandmother's letter is absolutely wonderful, and I'm trying to sort of see what, I don't quite remember what page it's on, but she basically says, I was really downtrodden and I was really depressed, and I had spent months in misery, and then all of a sudden I look up and there's Stenka, and we just held each other, and then we just held each other's hands, and we held each other's gaze, and we just cried with love and with hope. And it's, so the letters from my grandmother tend to be filled with wonderful emotion and joyful details. And then I have, eventually my grandfather is sent to the camps in November 42. My father manages again to be taken out at the very, very last minute from the transport. And my grandfather goes in, and we then have letters from both of them separately, because of course they were separated, even though they were in different barracks. And the letters from my grandfather are much more detailed. So they detail, they're very interesting if you're interested in how the camp worked in terms of contraband, because people would have goods snuck in. And he is very detailed as to what you can get for the different things. So you could barter for different things. So if you had if you had a cigarette, you might be able to get a little bit of extra bread from someone else, and things
And of
like
course,
that.
one of the key things for him is black shoe polish.
Absolutely.
Tell us why that mattered.
So the family on my father's side all had white hair from the time they were in their 20s and 30s. So and they were always told it made them look distinguished. So my grandfather, who was in his early 50s at the beginning of the war, had very, very white hair. And he was told that the Nazis needed you to work. So you had to be useful to them. And in order to be useful to them, of course, you had to be fit and you had to be young. So at the beginning of the war, he would dye his hair with hair dye. And Stenka, one of the things that she would sneak into the camp and into these parcels, the parcels always contained hair dye. Until at some stage, of course, because of the war, hair dye is no longer available. And then shoe polish does the trick. So
unimaginable.
Until, well, he had always a little tin of shoe polish, and that was possibly much more important than food at that stage, because you had to appear
young.
It didn't really quite matter how healthy you were, you had to appear healthy. So the shoe polish was absolutely crucial. And they managed to survive thanks to these parcels from 42 to 44, when they are eventually, and avoid being transported east. Eventually in 44, they're both transported east. And my grandfather actually, even to Auschwitz, took a little tin of his shoe polish. So I'm incredibly lucky to have these beautiful letters that have allowed me to have.
But I know you've discovered new family who are young and alive and part of your family now, and that must be one of the joys of doing this book. But also you've rediscovered your grandparents, who sadly aren't with us anymore. But all this time, where was your father? Tell us about his story and what happened to him.
So my father is incredible, because you have to imagine this. It's 1943. I mean, he's 22 years old. He lives in Prague. He's Jewish. His parents are in concentration camps, and his transport notice has arrived in March 1943. And he's decided there's no one to get him out of this transport. So he decides he is going to abscond. So with the help of Lothar and the help of the paint factory manager, who is a very brave man called Mr. Novak. And Mr. Novak, I've traced all these people's children, so I've dressed, and they all actually kept records of the story. They felt it was perhaps remarkable to them. So they, luckily for me, kept all these records. So he is 22. He's been hiding in the paint factory for 2 months, and he knows that he knows he's on the Gestapo wanted list, because he's absconded from a transport. So they're looking for him, and they're looking for him in Prague, and he is hiding in a makeshift room in the factory in Prague. It's a functioning factory, so during the day 50 people walk in, and my father has to lie very, very quiet, pretend like there's no one there, and then all he can do is, at night, there's a tiny little window, he can climb out of the window and have a little bit of fresh air. And of course, the paint factory, again, is still there. The little window is still there. So I have his accounts, and then I have Mr. Novak's daughter's accounts. And
so you've been back to the factory and seen the little.
Yeah, I have steps. So I mean, I tried to go to. I mean, I'm so lucky to have my grandparents' house in the countryside is still there. The flat in Prague. So I tried to retrace their steps. I tried to walk along the same paths, up the same staircases, hold on to the same railings up. And I was lucky to be able to see the little room, where my father was hidden. So in one of those nights where he has a little bit of freedom, a friend of his best friend Zdenek, and again, I have Zdenek's accounts, his best friend Zdenek comes in to visit him, and, they share a little bit of stories and alcohol and banter. And Zdenek says to him, joking, because Zdenek had been sent to Berlin as a forced laborer. So Zdenek wasn't Jewish. And I suppose people that are not familiar with this might not know that just men in Prague, for example, were sent to work in different factories in Germany or wherever it was in the Reich that they were needed. So So Zdeněk had been working in Berlin in a paint factory, and they were overworked. A lot of the people in the paint factory had been sent to concentration camps. A lot of the forced laborers had been deported. So in May 1943, Zdeněk says, Hans, if you could come and help me, it would be just perfect. And Hans decides that that's what he's going to do. So there's a check saying that says the darkest shadow is just beneath the candle. So if you're going to hide anywhere, you don't hide around in the periphery where the light is going to give you up. You hide in the center of it all where it is dark and no one will think of looking for you. So that's what he does. He goes, and I think you have to be 22 and you have to be a bit of a prankster and you have to have nothing to lose and to have those letters from your parents saying, do whatever you can to survive, stay safe, but do not come here. So he decides that he's going to go and hide, or not hide, he's going to go to Berlin and pretend he's not a Jew, pretend he's not Hans Neumann. He is going to pretend he's Anne Sebba. And of course, that ID card that I found as a little girl detective is the
Suddenly
ID card.
you understood.
So he in that box that he left me with the ID card, he wrote a little bit about, I suppose there were sort of a retrospective diary of his time in Berlin. So I could piece all of this together. And Zdeněk Tuma also wrote quite a lot. And you have these sort of two Czech boy pranksters in Berlin from 1943 to 1945.
And he even has an affair with a German woman, or a relationship. Is it a love affair? It is a bit of a love affair.
I think he has
a cover.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of women. I mean, I think he's 22.
Yes.
Because the family was quite assimilated, actually. My father, and I suppose this was very lucky at that particular time in his life, he wasn't circumcised. Because if he had been, that would have limited his options. But he was trying to access more information because he was trying to pass off information.
Yes.
To someone that he called in his papers the Dutch student. And actually someone's approached me and said, I know who the Dutch student was, and the Dutch student was actually an English spy. So I don't know, but I know.
So you're still learning more. There's going to be a sequel.
I know, no, I'm done with, I mean, I adored this journey, but I think I need to move on from my family to other things.
No. Well, I found the Berlin phase of your book utterly gripping because you say he was 22 and what else do you do? And I take what you're saying, but I also think it was incredibly courageous. But perhaps more frightening was the phase when he was in this little partition for hours at a time in the factory before Berlin and couldn't do anything. And that's, of course, when he started taking watches apart, and why you call the book When Time Stopped. I mean, or one of the reasons. But you remember as an adult his fascination with watches and clocks. How do you explain that as part of his personality and what he'd gone through?
Well, I think if you take my father before the war, he is careless and he is a prankster, and I don't think he would have really had the focus to take apart and watch. And he certainly wouldn't have had the discipline to sit there. I mean, he wasn't particularly good with his hands, so I think he just willed this. You know, he spent, as I grew up in Venezuela, he had 297 watches, and he spent every.
That's quite a lot.
Quite a lot. And you know, and he would spend. He had a special room, which was a long, dark room. It was windowless, which, you know, in Venezuela is quite odd because you want to let the light in. And it was windowless. He had all sorts of lights that illuminated and magnifying glasses, and he would spend hours repairing the mechanisms and ensuring they all worked. So they all ticked, these watches, these 297 of them. And of course, you know, they weren't quartz watches, they were old pocket watches. And so I think what happens perhaps and starts happening at that moment when he's hiding in the factory. And I think it was more difficult. I don't know if it was scarier hiding in the factory, but it certainly was more difficult because he couldn't make a sound. And he was completely isolated in this room. And he said to me once that he had started looking at watches at a time where he thought time was standing still. And he was so worried that time wasn't passing. Because of course, when you're isolated and you're and you're there and nothing happens, there's a time warp. A little bit actually, like us and with isolation now, you sort of time goes into this weird, it's not, I don't know. I've often actually had to look at my watch and ensure that time is indeed passing. And that's what my father did. He opens the watch and he needs to find that comfort that time is still ticking, that even though nothing is happening and he's just lying there very, very still, and every second becomes an hour, that time is
I
actually.
can see that when he's in hiding. Don't want to play amateur psychologist with you, psychiatrist, but it must have had a deeper meaning for him later on to have 300 of these objects in Venezuela. How do you explain it as an adult that he was trying to bring back that time with
Well,
his when he knew his survival depended on being silent? He was trying to bring back an earlier time of happiness? Or should we not look for reasons? It was just something that when he was a successful industrialist in Venezuela, he was able to collect and had the wherewithal to do it. I mean, I'm sure you must have thought about it a lot, what it meant to
oh no,
him.
I have no doubt. I mean, he collected many things, but this was a real obsession, the watches. And it took up an enormous amount of his time and his energy. And it was, watches were always important in his life. His father was very, very punctual. And as a matter of fact, when my father was late for dinner, he often found when he arrived to dinner or sort of, late, instead of the goulash and nedliki that would be a normal, Sunday dinner, there would be a pocket watch, and he wouldn't get any dinner if he was late.
Oh.
So I think watches always played something. It was about regaining, obviously, the time before the war.
Yes.
It was about reconnecting with his father a little bit, because I think he eventually becomes, his father had always said that he was shambolic and good for nothing, and my father wanted to be a sculptor, and of course the serious thing would have been for him to take over the paint factory, which ironically, of course, after the war, because he has to become this very disciplined man in Berlin to survive, after the war he continues to be this disciplined man, and he does eventually.
And becomes extremely successful. And you must long, I mean, he'd be so proud of you for what you've achieved. You must long to discuss it with him. Do you have one question you'd ask him, or just be so grateful that you've done it? It's a memorial to him.
I have about 10 questions that I would ask him. And I mean, there's, and I wouldn't know if to ask him a huge one as sort of, how did you survive in Berlin, or just a tiny one. I mean, there's still this one moment where he's called into the Gestapo headquarters in Prague. And I know he went in there just as he was saved from a transport. So just as his parents were deported. And I just want to know what it was that was said in that conversation between this Jew that was my father and this Gestapo man, who was, so there's lots of little details like that. But I have a zillion questions, but at the same time, I feel like I know him so much better now than I did when he was alive.
That's the tragedy. If only you could put time back and have a different relationship with him, or do not feel that. It's better that you've learned it as a mother and an adult yourself.
I think you have to realize that I don't think he would have we had a lovely relationship in many ways. I mean, in all ways. It was just not we didn't discuss emotions. We discussed, we played games, we did logic puzzles, we solved mysteries together. So this is a way of continuing our relationship, this book, because it has allowed us really to piece together the mystery.
Yes.
Him by leaving, because he's left me these papers, and I, because I'm playing the little girl detective that I always played with him.
and so much that you must have learned about you. I mean, you grew up as a Catholic. You've now discovered you're half Catholic, half Jewish, and the gift that you've given to your children to learn about their ancestry as well. I mean, they must have learned an awful lot about their history. I know they came with you on a lot of these trips. So, I mean, apart from being very proud of you and for your achievement, if you could select one thing that you've learned from this book about life, because it must have, you know, anyone who reads it will learn a lot about survival and courage and history, but is there one thing you can pick out that you've learned from it that's changed your life?
Oh, you know, I think what has really changed my life is realizing actually that in all this darkness and all this horror, there is always, if you just search for it carefully and patiently, there is always so much light and so much beauty still, and that it doesn't matter what you do, how you imprison people and what you do to them. It's very difficult to imprison people's minds. You can imprison bodies. You can not let them go out. You can not let them eat. You can starve them. You can punish them. But minds are free. And it is remarkable how people in these conditions, whereas it's my father, you know, hiding in plain sight in Berlin, as he knows his family are in concentration camps, or whether it's my grandmother in the camp or my grandfather in the camp, they still manage to dream, they still manage to hope, they still manage to have ideas, and they still manage to find beauty, to focus on things around them and find beauty where you would expect there to be none.
Yeah, that of course is Viktor Frankl and The Search for Meaning. And exactly, I think if there's one book to keep by your bedside, it does teach you that the one thing you can't take away. I was thinking of all the emotional input that you've gathered and understanding about life, but there's also some practical things. You've gathered letters and the ring that your grandfather made. That to me is one of the most extraordinary material possessions that I'd love you just to tell that story, because I think if that were mine, I'd want to look at it every day and just think, my goodness, in the depths of horror, beauty. So what's the story of this ring?
That's that. I don't know if you can see it there,
yeah.
But it's perhaps not the most elegant ring you can imagine. And when I first found it, I was completely baffled. And you're right, I look at it every day. I carry it usually around my necklace, but my children gave me a necklace for my birthday, which was 2 days ago. So I feel like I shouldn't, I should, but I usually carry it with me whenever I need a little bit of luck. And it is a piece of copper pipe. So when I found it, I thought, what a strange thing to keep. And it was kept by my uncle Lothar, and I just didn't understand it. And if you look carefully, it has a Z and an N carved into it. And I now know that this was a piece of copper pipe, probably destined for some plumbing, which my grandfather, in the middle of the camp of Theresienstadt, stole. And he was an engineer, a very sort of serious man, not an artist. And with what I'm told would have been a nail and a hammer, he just fashioned a ring. And it's a tiny little ring, and it had the initials Zdenka Neumann, and it was a way of saying thank you to Zdenka, to this incredibly beautiful, brave woman who risked her life throughout the war to keep my parents and my father and my uncle and my grandparents alive. So Otto, my grandfather, did it for Zdenka, and as a way of saying thank you. And of course, he had nothing else to give her because he owned nothing by that stage.
How did you discover that ring?
So it was left in Lothar's box. So my cousin Madla, who's Lothar's daughter, gave it to me. And of course, when I traced Zdenka's daughter, she had heard of the ring, and Zdenka, for reasons that you'll have to read the book to find out why, felt she shouldn't keep the ring and gave it back to Lothar. So the ring has made its way to me And actually, I think it belongs with Stenka's family, so I'm going to take it to her.
So many extraordinary stories, extraordinary characters, a hellish time, and yet you found beauty and redemption. It really is a wonderful book. Deservedly, you've had amazing reviews, and I know it's done very well, and it'll soon be in paperback. You must be thinking of another book. So one of the big changes is that you're now an author, you're going to be writing more books. Has it changed your life dramatically to have completed this? I'm sure it must have done. You must feel such a sense of satisfaction that you've done it.
It has. I mean, I feel huge satisfaction. I feel you know, it's what I always wanted to do when I was a little girl. If you had asked me age 10 what I wanted to do, I would have said I want to be a detective and I want to be a writer. And I've always written. I just did it more as therapy rather than. I never thought it was good enough. I have all these degrees in literature, and I think if you read lots of very good things, you realize you're never going to be that good. And most people maybe don't care and just have the boldness, or maybe they are that good, but I just couldn't do it. And then, so it stopped me from writing. But then as I uncovered this story, which actually we go back to your first question, as I uncovered these remarkable stories of love and courage and beauty, I thought if I don't tell them, no one else is going to. So then the story became much more important than the writing. So now actually I'm all about telling stories, and you know, if I'm a little insecure about my writing, if it's not good enough, you know what, at least I still get to tell the story. So yes, it has changed me. I'm bolder because I think the story is more important than the writing, and I'm just working on another story which I think is remarkable. And
well, I think we all look forward to the next one. I'd like to thank you very much. I'm sorry we haven't had a live audience, but I think lots of people will enjoy hearing this talk for Chiswick Literary Festival, and read the book is the main thing. But thank you for sharing all those stories today, Ariana. It's lovely to talk to you as ever.
I hope to see you soon, and I hope to see you hopefully in the Literary Festival in Chiswick next year. Maybe hopefully we'll be
good. It'll be real.
Exactly.
As this is. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you
now.
Thank you.